Farm Arena video again, and falsely claimed that it showed voter fraud right in front of people's eyes and was the tip of the iceberg. Then he cited 2 election workers by name, baselessly accused them of quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of heroin or cocaine, and suggested that they were criminals whose places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. Thereafter, the 2 election workers received numerous death threats. On December 15th, the defendant summoned the incoming acting attorney general and the incoming acting deputy general and others to the Oval Office to discuss allegations of election fraud. During the meeting, the Justice Department officials specifically refuted the defendant's claims about State Farm Arena, explaining to him that the activity shown on the tape co-conspirator 1 had used was benign. On December 23rd, a day after the defendant's chief of staff personally observed the signature verification process at the Cobb County Civic Center and notified the defendant that state election officials were conducting themselves in an exemplary fashion and would find fraud if it existed, the defendant tweeted that the Georgia officials administering the signature verification process were trying to hide evidence of election fraud and were terrible people. In a phone call on December 27th, the defendant spoke with the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general. During the call, the defendant again pressed the unfounded claims regarding State Farm Arena, and the 2 top Justice Department officials again rebutted the allegations, telling him that the Justice Department had reviewed videotape and interviewed witnesses and had not identified any suspicious conduct. On December 31st, the defendant signed a verification affirming false election fraud allegations made on his behalf in a lawsuit filed in his name against the Georgia governor. In advance of the filing, co-conspirator 2, who was advising the defendant on the lawsuit, acknowledged in an email that he and the defendant had, since signing a previous verification, been made aware that some of the allegations and evidence proffered by the experts has been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with that knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate. The defendant and co-conspirator 2 caused the defendant's signed verification to be filed nonetheless. On January 2nd, 4 days before the Congress's certification proceeding, the defendant and others called Georgia's Secretary of State. During the call, the defendant lied to the Georgia Secretary of State to induce him to alter Georgia's popular vote count and call into question the validity of the Biden electors' votes, which had been transmitted to Congress weeks before, including as follows. A. The defendant raised allegations regarding the State Farm Arena video and repeatedly disparaged one of the same election workers that co-conspirator 1 had maligned on December 10th, using her name almost 20 times and falsely referring to her as a professional vote scammer and hustler. In response, the Georgia Secretary of State refuted this. You're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that co-conspirator 1 or his people, they sliced and diced that video and took it out of context. When the Georgia Secretary of State then offered a link to the video that would disprove co-conspirator 1's claims, the defendant responded, I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have a much, Georgia Secretary of State, I have a much better link. B. The defendant asked about rumors that paper ballots cast in the election were being destroyed, and the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel explained to him that the claim had been investigated and was not true. C. The defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia, causing the Georgia Secretary of State to respond, well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were 2. 2 people that were dead voted, and so your information is wrong. That was 2. D. The defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots in Georgia's election, which the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel refuted, explaining, "We've been going through each of those as well, and those numbers that we got, that defendant's counsel was just saying they're not accurate. Every one we've been through are people that lived in Georgia, moved to a different state, but then moved back to Georgia legitimately. They moved back in years ago. This was not like something just before the election." E. In response to multiple other of the defendant's allegations, the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel told the defendant that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was examining all such claims and finding no merit to them. F. The defendant said that he needed to find 11,780 votes and insinuated that the Georgia Secretary of State and his counsel could be subject to criminal prosecution if they failed to find election fraud as he demanded, stating, "And you're going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more than illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal, that's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. It's a big risk to you and to the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel, your lawyer." The next day, on January 3rd, the defendant falsely claimed that the Georgia Secretary of State had not addressed the defendant's allegations, publicly stating that the Georgia Secretary of State was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false information that more than 10,300 dead people had voted in Georgia. This is Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Let's take a break, and we will be back in just a short bit to continue the reading of the full indictment against Donald J. Trump in the case of January 6th. Stay tuned. Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland, facepalmamerica.com. Let's continue reading the January 6th indictment against Donald J. Trump. Michigan. On November 5th, 2020, the defendant claimed that there had been a suspicious dump of votes, purportedly illegitimate ballots, stating, "In Detroit, there were hours of unexplained delay in delivering many of the votes for counting. The final batch did not arrive until 4 in the morning, even though the polls closed at 8 o'clock. So they brought it in, and the batches came in, and nobody knew where they came from." On November 20th, 3 days before the Michigan governor's signed certificate of ascertainment notifying the federal government that based on the popular vote, Biden's electors were to represent Michigan's voters, the defendant held a meeting in the Oval Office with the Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives and the Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate. In the meeting, the defendant raised his false claim, among others, of an illegitimate vote dump in Detroit. In response, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader told the defendant that he had lost Michigan not because of fraud, but because the defendant had underperformed with certain voter populations in the state. Upon leaving their meeting, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader issued a statement reiterating this. The Senate and House Oversight Committees are actively engaged in a thorough review of Michigan's elections process, and we have faith in the committee process to provide greater transparency and accountability to our citizens. We have not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan, and as state legislative leaders, we will follow the law and follow the normal process regarding Michigan's electors, just as we have throughout this election. On December 1st, the defendant raised his Michigan vote dump claim with the Attorney General, who responded that what had occurred in Michigan had been the normal vote counting process and that there was no indication of fraud in Detroit. Despite this, the next day, the defendant made a knowingly false statement that in Michigan, at 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. Nobody knows anything about it. It's corrupt. Detroit is corrupt. I have a lot of friends in Detroit. They know it. But Detroit is totally corrupt. On December 4th, co-conspirator 1 sent a text message to the Michigan House Speaker reiterating his unsupported claim of election fraud and attempted to get the Michigan House Speaker to assist in reversing the ascertainment of the legitimate Biden electors, stating, "Looks like Georgia may well hold some factual hearings and change the certification under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution." As co-conspirator 2 explained, they don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan. Similarly, on December 7th, despite still having established no fraud in Michigan, co-conspirator 1 sent a text intended for the Michigan Senate Majority Leader. "So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states that the election is in dispute. There's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of December 8th under Michigan law." On December 14th, the day that electors in states across the country were required to vote and submit their votes to Congress, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader announced that, contrary to the defendants' requests, they would not decertify the legitimate election results or electors in Michigan. The Michigan Senate Majority Leader's public statement included, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan." The Michigan House Speaker's public statement read in part, "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job, but I love our republic too. I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump simply because some think that there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason, and that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we'd lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College, and I can't stand for that. I won't." On January 6, 2021, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claim regarding an illicit dump of more than 100,000 ballots in Detroit. Pennsylvania. On November 11, 2020, the defendant publicly maligned a Philadelphia city commissioner for stating on the news that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. As a result, the Philadelphia city commissioner and his family received death threats. On November 25th, the day after Pennsylvania's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment and thus certified to the federal government that Biden's electors were legitimate electors for the state, co-conspirator 1 orchestrated an event at a hotel in Gettysburg attended by state legislators. Co-conspirator 1 falsely claimed that Pennsylvania had issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. In the days thereafter, a campaign staffer wrote internally that co-conspirator 1's allegation was just wrong, and there's no way to defend it. The deputy campaign manager responded, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating." On December 4th, after 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature issued a public statement that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote, and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and constitution. The defendant retweeted a post